Hello and welcome to Business Class. My name is Shantanu Prakash, and today on the show, we have an amazing entrepreneur, Greg Moran. He is the co-founder and CEO of Zoomcar. Zoomcar is India's largest self-drive mobility platform. And Greg has built an amazing company in 6 years. Welcome, Greg, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So I was very impressed, Greg, with what Zoomcar has achieved in 6 years. You have 5 million rides, you've raised $100 million of capital, you're across 50 cities in the country, and you're revolutionizing and transforming the entire transportation ecosystem in the country. But it wasn't like this when you were growing up in New York, right? So take us down memory lane in your journey to growing up in New York and then going to college in UPenn, and then finding yourself as a founder of a company in Bangalore.
Sure. Yeah, I would say it's a fairly unorthodox journey. You don't see it happen too often, and in fact, it's usually the opposite, where you have a lot of folks coming from India and moving to the US and starting a business. But first and foremost for me, I've always considered myself a city guy. So whether it's living in New York, whether it's living in Los Angeles, Boston, San Francisco. I've always considered myself first and foremost, I love cities, and I think cities are totally the future for the next 50 years, 100 years. And for India, of course, there's just so many amazing cities, and there's so much happening in cities, and there's so many opportunities. And I think for me, it was only natural that I was going to somehow land in a bustling, hectic city like Bangalore to do something exciting.
So I believe that when you decided to set up this business in India, you actually did a tour of 25 cities. Apart from the Bangalores and the Mumbais of the world, you even went to places like Surat and Chandigarh. Right. So what were you searching for?
Yeah, well, I think I was really searching for sort of that soul and understanding of kind of what it really meant to have kind of like day-to-day personal mobility challenges. And so I wanted to not just kind of break out of that mold where it's just the top 5 cities, and understand also in those like tier 2 or tier 3 towns kind of what the pain points were there as well. Because ultimately we wanted to build a holistic solution that was going to be comprehensive, that was not just going to work for the top 5 cities, but work for all urban Indians. And I think that really helped.
But how did you think of this idea? You were in UPenn, and I believe you were happily playing the piano, and you were doing a whole bunch of amazing, very American things. So how did this idea dawn on you that you need to do something for mobility in India?
Sure, yeah. I think for me, there's no one trigger as such. I think I was fortunate that even as an undergraduate, I was able to study a lot about India. Had a lot of good buddies and friends from here. Kind of always had a penchant for the food. Always enjoyed the food. But I think more than that, when I was working in investment banking and private equity, we actually had an office over here. So we had an office in Hyderabad. Got exposure on the deal side to understand a lot of the dynamics, what was going on in the energy infra space. So I was doing a lot of clean tech deals like solar, wind, energy storage. And so I was always a big environmental guy, and always thought about sustainability as a big mission statement. And then I started to look more closely at some of the challenges that India was facing, given the deals that we were working on. And I realized that I wanted to do something more in an adjacent sector, not just like infrastructure as such, but something that's more in the private sector side of things, which is more technology software driven, where you could have a similarly disruptive impact, but not have to worry about as kind of much top-down intervention as such. And so that's where I felt that transportation and mobility would really pose a great opportunity because it fit all of those criteria while still having a big ROI.
It sounds amazing to me that as a young person, instead of starting business career in the US, you actually thought that India is such a big country with 1 billion people, complex problems, and let me go to India and do something to help the country solve some of its most complex problems, like transportation, for example. It almost seems to me like you had a mission. So like the missionaries who came to India and said, let's go to India and let's set up these parishes and let's do something for the people. It almost sounds to me that you were driven by an evangelical mission to cross the shores and come and do something here?
Well, I think part of it may be going back, to my high school roots. I actually went to a Jesuit all-boys high school. So when you are in Jesuit school, for those of you who've been, it's kind of like the man for others, sort of like human for others, sort of thought process. And it's always very internationally oriented, as the Jesuits were way back in the day. But I think so. Maybe on some level, some of that could have resonated and sunk in. But I think for me also, I think the triple bottom line aspect. I think it first and foremost started with the environment, to be honest. It was even more of a pull about the planet and knowing that India was one of the largest constituents as it related to the planet. I always related more on a personal level to India than China. So I think for me, it was sort of very, sort of natural that it was going to be India.
Sure. And I think in some sense, I see that you are very forward looking to think of India as a destination to start a business because you mentioned Blue Ocean, and the fact is the US is a hyper competitive space.
For sure.
There's a war for talent, there's war for capital, and I think you did a really smart move by taking this long flight and coming to India, because everything is new here. The whole country is transforming. But tell me, Greg, why haven't other and lots more entrepreneurs followed your lead from the US and other countries to set up shop in India?
Yeah, no, I think that's a tough one, because it's something as an entrepreneur, I wish it were happening more, because I think it's really great. It just makes the ecosystem that more rich in terms of the diversity and the thought. I would say just directly though, on a couple of levels, I would say on one, I feel like the broader government in India and the tourism boards and all, they haven't really done the best job of promoting India super aggressively as a tourist destination on par with, say, like China or Thailand or something else in this general part of the world, right? So I think when you don't do that, it just it's hard to kind of connect the synapses in the brain. Like you're not really linking. Then can I do a business opportunity here? Can I pursue something? It becomes tougher. And then on the other hand, you kind of look at unfortunately a lot of the World Bank studies that come out. India, it's not like we're in the top 20 in ease of doing business, right? We're typically very kind of far down or somewhere in the middle of that list. And I think as Americans or as Europeans, where the countries tend to be pretty high up on that list, I think that friction or perceived friction is something which for a lot of folks who are naturally risk averse, it becomes very tough for them to kind of get over that hump, so to speak.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. You said if more people came to India as tourists,
right,
they would come here, they would see what's going on, and they would just think, oh, this is a place I can build a business.
Right.
But that's not the way most people who want to attract businesses think.
Right.
Right? They think they should go do seminars in universities or invite investment companies to come to India and talk about other sort of investment incentives.
Right.
But do you think if more tourists came to India, they would actually set up shop here?
I do, because I think the reality is, well, first of all, when you come kind of halfway around the world, you tend to not stay for 2 days, right? So you'll stay for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and especially a lot of the youngsters. Why is it that so many more Americans backpack across Southeast Asia than India? It shouldn't be that way. I mean, you should have more. And I think the simple reality is that if you're able to kind of create a slightly more open environment over there, I think what it does is it allows people to kind of get a unique lens into the culture, into the opportunities, into the business even, or maybe even if you think about like externships as an opportunity. But for me, it's about empathy. And if you're able to, because the best businesses are always built bottom up. Very few businesses are manufactured top down. It's the bottom up insights that you get from the ground, especially on the consumer side, but also on the business side, B2B side. And I think that's where the disruption happens.
So Zoomcar is a new business for India, but it's not a new business in the world.
That's right. I think, in some levels we borrowed from a lot of those other companies and concepts and then created something a little bit more organic. And we have done a lot of innovating in terms of offshoots of what we started with and adding new products and categories. But I think in terms of like the origin source of the idea, it's not like, it's not like we created a new social network, or it's not like we created Uber. Uber, when it was created, was like path breaking, right? The notion of getting a taxi at the tap of a button, it was like insane. And the notion of food delivery, it was created in the US and then revolutionized in China. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just how it's evolved.
So of course, we'll credit all these amazing US innovations to the fact that they have a better school system. Okay.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
But now that you've been on the ground in India for 7 years, if you weren't doing Zoomcar, what India-specific business do you think you would have done?
That's a great one. I think for me, I would be doing something in agriculture, agri-tech, because for me, agri, water, and waste are the three pillars, which will propel Indian cities either onto the right trajectory for the next 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, or onto a sideways trajectory, which will make it very, very tough for the next 20, 30, 50 years. I mean, hopefully mobility, what we're helping to solve is making that a little bit better. But the big three, in my mind, it's always going to be clean, consistent water. It's going to be a much more localized, more robust agricultural supply chain with local agri produce. And then thinking about how do you look at closed loop waste systems, because I mean I can tell you, walking to work every day, 20 minutes walk, I mean I see massive piles, heaps of trash. I see huge issues of clean water every single day. It hits you. I see every day in terms of the lack of better access to produce, etc. So that's still a huge problem. And the reality is no startup in India today is trying to solve that. And so I think that if I weren't doing what I was doing, I'd probably be doing something.
That's a great idea, and I'm sure some people who watch this interview will probably take that up.
Hopefully,
yeah. And they can contact you for sort of.
I'll be the first seed investor. So, yeah, I think so.
Okay, so building Zoomcar would have been an amazing roller coaster experience for you. So when you first came to India, on the advice of your Indian friends and what you read in international relations, I'm sure the reality on the ground would have been a little different from what you had imagined India to be. So what have been your sort of biggest challenges in building Zoomcar from a perspective of regulation or human capital or just dealing with local authorities?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Well, surprisingly, I always thought it was going to be easier to hire engineers. So I think outsider looking in, everyone's like, oh, India is awash in engineers. And I was like, that's true. But there's also a million people who are trying to hire those engineers. So it has been always a lot harder to hire great engineers because of that competition. But having said that, I think, the regulatory regime, of course, is very different from what you see in the US or Europe. But I think until you actually get on ground, you don't really kind of understand how the actual business gets executed, in terms of the reality of operations. And I think there's no substitute for doing when it comes to ops. Like, you can build a business plan, you can build a financial model, and that's all great. But until you kind of see how it plays out, until you see the customer, I think the way that the customers responded to the product, in many ways, there's always a lot of learning and insight, which is, maybe it's about half right, then it's about half wrong. And I think, when you're abroad, when you're not on ground, you don't really appreciate some of these other sort of first and last mile realities. And I think that's the one thing, which, like, for instance, like network coverage, something very basic, right? In the US, it's almost like an afterthought. It's like a joke. I mean, everywhere, of course, you have perfect 4G. I mean, no one even thinks about it, right? But until you're actually on ground in India, seeing it, feeling it, like the impact of not having, even today, you still don't have totally perfect, pitch perfect, ubiquitous 4G coverage. And that makes it tough to do business. I mean, it's not easy, like for our type of business. If you're an O2O last mile business, it's not easy. If you want to try to open up an electric scooter, if you want to open up a bicycle on the road, if you want to open up a car, and you have even intermittent leakage and droppage on the network, that's a problem. So those are the kind of things that you don't really appreciate or understand when you're not.
But I guess it's improving. Maybe not at the same speed that you would wish, but it's still improving.
It is. I think it's all about relative improvement and progress. I think on the governmental side, I do see a stronger, forceful push towards digitization in a lot of the processes around our ecosystem and mobility. Mm-hmm. I think the digitization is a really important one that the government will continue to hopefully push for aggressively. And I think streamlining in what we've seen is that there are so many organizations that kind of touch our business. So I think what we've seen is that the government, at least in some states, like Telangana is one great example. Andhra has also been quite good in this, where they've been progressive in terms of like streamlining a lot of functions and digitizing. And I think that streamlining functions and like closing some offices, opening some other offices that are more relevant to help facilitate this, I think is a really important step. And it seems like the government is hopefully moving in that direction.
Sure, Greg. So your business is so closely linked to what happens with regulation and law. So there have been two sort of big things happening in your industry recently.
Right.
One is the Motor Vehicles Act.
Right.
And the other thing is this huge slowdown in the automobile sector, which in some way is being blamed on the sharing economy. What are your comments on both of these things?
Yeah, I think both are very, very complex, but to tackle the former, so when you think about the Motor Vehicles Act, I'd say, look, I feel like this has been, behind the scenes, this has been going on for 5-6 years. The government's been in collaboration with players like us, players like, Ola, Uber, others, for a long time. And I think it's really about, making sure that, people are aware that there are so many idle assets out there, on the road. And I think long-term, the government realizes that there needs to be some streamlining of regulation to allow for all of these idle assets to be leveraged for shared mobility, because that is in and of itself going to help reduce congestion manyfold, because you don't technically need then all these other vehicles out there because they're already out in the road. And so you're able to share more vehicles, and that actually in turn helps take other vehicles off the road and helps improve air quality. So that's an important one that I think the Motor Vehicles Act is getting towards and moving in that direction. On the second point, as you think about the slowdown, yes, I mean, certainly it's been there. I think it's, for a lot of folks, it's a pretty humbling experience if you're selling all these lakhs and lakhs of units, and you're seeing it getting slashed by 20, 30, 40, 50% in some cases month on month. But I think to go and point the finger at shared mobility, I think that's probably not the real reason here. And shared mobility, we are a small part of what's happening, but if you look at it, it's not like something overnight changed in the last 6 months, right? Shared mobility has been around for some time, and shared mobility has been at a big scale for the last 3-4 years. So it's something else that's really causing. And I think there's three things that are at play. One, you have the BS6, the norms that are coming in April, May, and of next year, and a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines as consumers, because the product lineup is changing a lot from OEMs, right? So the diesel cars are getting converted to petrol or CNG, and so there's a lot of flux around BS6, and I think you've heard the regulatory bodies speak on that as well. Also there is on one level there's a huge financing shortfall when you think about NBFC and bank debt for individuals who are seeking credit for vehicles, and the market is just not there. High LTVs that used to be there are not there. Lower interest rates that used to be there, also not there. Tenors that were longer are not there. So it's tough on the financing side. And then finally, I would say that, you have, generally speaking, products that are not necessarily, super path breaking. So it's not like you're seeing a groundbreaking Tesla product that's here on the ground. You're seeing incremental innovation, and you're seeing people who are holding vehicles longer, but also who are willing to kind of not go and buy vehicles, because a lot of times they're moving around between cities. And so some of our products are trying to address this, in fact, in terms of shared subscription. But that's something which really those are more, I would say, material points which are impacting, as opposed to just shared mobility on its own.
So just as India is competing for capital with other countries, for global capital,
right,
there's also a competition for entrepreneurial and human capital. And your realization
Absolutely.
when you came to India was, it's easier to hire engineers here. But you said, but there aren't enough good engineers. Or the war for talent has also reached the shores of Bangalore. Right. So what do you think the government of India or Indian society as a whole should do more, so that we are going to win the competition for entrepreneurial energy and talent, and the more people like you can come from different parts of the world and set up shop in India?
Right. So I think the one aspect which is still, I think we made great strides, just to put it in context, in the last 5-6 years, phenomenal strides. I think the next 5 years, I believe we'll be able to exponentially double down on those
But
improvements.
like the top 2 or 3
Yeah.
things you think that we should be doing?
Yeah, so sure. I think for me, number one starts with the education system. And I would say, we need to do far more in the way of externships and focused, structured externships, externship come internship. So, that has to be there. Some of the top schools do it. Some of the schools, at the middle of the rung do it as well, but it needs to be much more focused as an effort and structured. And there needs to be proper reflection, and there needs to be a better rubric for that. Because if you're able to do that, because the problem is in Indian education, a lot of it's very theoretical, and you need to mix the pragmatic, in terms of the formal skills, and that's something which I find missing at times. That's one. Secondly, there needs to be a much more focus, stringent focus on empathy building. And when I talk about empathy and soft skills, so I put soft skills together. I mean, that's the biggest soft skill in my mind. But when I talk about broader soft skills, it's empathy is on one hand, but communication is something which is sorely lacking from young graduates today. Their ability to communicate effectively, clearly, crisply, and the ability to collaborate, I find usually severely lacking in young people today in India. And so I think if we're able to solve for communication plus collaboration, then you combine that technical talent on top of it, then it's deadly. Then it's a very, very powerful combination. And I think right now those are the only aspects holding us back.
So it all sort of leads back to the education system finally.
It does, right? I mean, there's no two ways about it, but I think it's just about being on the ground and having that ground up, bottoms up understanding. And I think if you can just really, it goes back to one of my earlier points of inculcating curiosity. I think there needs to be that just burning curiosity. And I find too often, maybe it's the education system tramples that, but that curiosity needs to come out. And I find that my best employees by far, I can tell you, if you ask me the top 10%, cutting across different verticals in the company, the one characteristic that they all have is curiosity. They are the most curious people in the company, and they are the best performers.
Fantastic, Greg. So that's an amazing story, and wish you all the best as you build the company forward.
So I think for me, I'd be curious, given your background, when you think about the next 3 years, 5 years, and you think about what the government can really do, to better kind of develop this ecosystem and put us on a trajectory for more exponential growth. Are there 2 or 3 big things that you see that the public sector should be doing that they're not currently?
I think, Greg, that's a great question, firstly. And I think there are 1.25 billion people who are looking at the government for those answers, right? But I think there are some things that can happen in the long term.
Right.
There's some things that happen in the medium term, and some things can happen now. And I think what can happen now is what's more important.
I agree,
So I think things like changing the education system is, by definition, a long-term strategy. It's going to happen, but it's going to happen slowly.
Right.
Okay. But what can the government do right now? I think the most important thing is, firstly, get rid of this multiplicity of agencies that try to regulate exactly the same thing. And the transportation sector is actually a great example of that. You have the government, the federal government makes a law, and the state government says, okay, we'll see whether we want to implement that or not.
It's like the Motor Vehicles Act, actually.
Right, exactly. And that's a classic example of how we need to speak with one voice as a nation on important things, like transport regulation, for example. I think the other thing is a relentless push towards digitization. I think nothing has transformed India more over the past 5 years than the fact that we as a nation have become digital.
Right, I would agree.
In the way we transact, in the way we think, in the way we express ourselves. And that's going to happen irrespective of the government.
Right.
And the third most important thing is that the government should decide that it shouldn't be in the business of government as much as it is right now. I think Indians are very entrepreneurial people by themselves, but you need to leave them alone to do their thing.
Right.
So you oversight but you don't over-regulate.
Right.
I think that is, and I think the government is thinking in those lines. And I think we have a very proactive and a very dynamic government. I think what is challenging is that India is not the easiest country in the world to govern, right? And
that's probably an understatement. Yeah, it is tricky.
And as a country, we've had this policy that we want to do things in a more consensual approach. So this is not a nation that takes big bang decisions ruthlessly.
It's not China. It's not a 5-year industrial plan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we want to take big bang decisions, but we want to take them with empathy.
Right.
Because you have to take a very complex society along. And I think the government is doing a great job. Can it be done faster? For sure. But I think we are heading down this path of massive transformation that is going to unleash so much economic wealth and value, the likes of which I think the world hasn't seen in a very long time.
Right.
Because there is inherent growth in India. At the end of the day, you have 1.25 billion people. They got to eat, they got to consume food, they got to go to school, they got to drive a car. Or at least they need transportation.
Right.
And I think that's why the story of India is absolutely amazing. And I think you are in the right place at the right time.
Right. Well, hopefully. So yeah.
Sure.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think Greg Moran's story is interesting in more ways than one. Very rarely do we see someone who grows up in the US, goes to some of the finest US colleges, gets an amazing job in an investment bank, is doing big billion-dollar deals, and one day he decides to explore, so that in some sense, the dark side of the world. He takes a flight, comes to India, and sets up a transport and mobility business. So what are the chances of this happening? It's rare. But Greg did it. He built a really successful business. Zoomcar, 5 million rides, $100 million of raised capital, a footprint that's spread all across the country. And they've been pioneers in a bunch of things. And it's been 7 years for Greg in India. And he has an opinion on every part of India, how the society should work, how the government should work. And more importantly, his vision for what India needs to do is very big. It's very all-encompassing, and he talks with equal passion about the transport business as he talks about agriculture and waste management and bringing supply chain to bring produce to consumers and so on. And I think the lesson in Greg's story is that India needs to open itself, needs to market itself better to thousands of more entrepreneurs like Greg, who would bring best practices from a US or Europe or Japan perspective to India, who would think India is a welcoming country to set up their entrepreneurial initiatives. I think the silver lining is that Greg is still here. He's still invested in India, both physically and emotionally, and he believes in the future of this country. So hopefully this will inspire many more people from across the world to make India as their choice for their entrepreneurial venture. For good reason, as Greg says, India is blue skies country. Everything is changing and everything that we require has got to be new. And it's not as hyper-competitive as the US. So this is an amazing story, and we'll track it for more years to come as Zoomcar moves to transform the mobility sector in India.